All right, everyone, welcome to the LMS or Learning Management System Primer. The goal of this primer really is to give you all an opportunity to kind of get some of the foundational basics about what is a learning management system before you get into some of our key articles. And what I wanted to do was really just give you some foundational pieces of knowledge so that when you read the two articles focused on learning management systems and the second one that deals with next generation digital learning environments, it all begins to make a whole lot of sense. So here's our very short primer on what is a learning management system. So the first thing that we need to understand is let's have a working definition. Now you'll see some working definitions in our articles for this week, but the key concept that I want you to walk away from is when you consider what an LMS is. An LMS is really, think of it as it is designed to be the central hub of learning that can be used in a variety of different classroom settings. So it's the central hub where you can disseminate information, you can disseminate announcements, you can email, you can communicate with your students, but it's the central hub where they can go and access presentations, PDFs, and other type of media and files that are related to a given course topic or learning activity. So if a learning management system is a hub, well, what kind of systems are out there? And if you think about it in its most simplest and basic form, there's really two types of LMSs. There's what I like to think of as your corporate LMSs, which are typically used by non-educational entities. These usually have a substantial investment that needs to be made. They're not cheap. They can be expensive, but because they also support a variety of different training and learning development needs, human resource compliance needs. So they offer a lot of reporting, a lot of analytics, and the kinds of features that are important to organizations, especially from a tracking perspective. So the corporate ones, some of these you may not have heard of, some of them you may have heard of, such as SumTotal, Cornerstone, Litmos, Adobe Captivate Prime, just to name a few. But these are typically known as corporate level learning management systems. And typically their audiences are geared for corporate entities, human resources, training, for some sort of compliance type of training, things of that nature. Whereas the second type of LMS is educational. And these are, well, exactly what you would think they would be. They are LMSs that are geared towards the use by educational entities. This can be colleges, K through 12, for-profit universities, career colleges, etc. Some of these, many of you may have seen or have heard of in the past, such as Blackboard, Canvas, Moodle, Pearson SuccessNet, which is a recent entry into the field, as well as, of course, Google Classroom that many of you are using. Although there are some people who argue that Google Classroom is not a learning management system, but based on some of the definitions that I've seen, we'll just say for right now, we'll lump it in there as a learning management system. But there are a variety of different types of LMSs. This is not an exhaustive list, but the key message here is that when you look at a learning management system, you have to understand who's the main audience, right? Is it a corporate audience or is it an educational audience? Because they will have slightly different features and functions that you'll be reading about that could be, again, important maybe in education, but not necessarily as relevant in corporate. For example, the use of a grade book is important in education, but in corporate, they're not necessarily looking at a grade book versus I just need to be able to track that somebody completed something. And that's a whole other discussion onto itself. But when you think about the typical learning management system, the first generation of learning management systems can be traced back to the 1970s, but it was really more of a administrative tool. It was really used for the purposes of registering students to classes, whether it was brick and mortar or some sort of variant of distance learning. It really didn't, it doesn't really reflect what we use for LMSs or what we use LMSs for today. The 1980s, it kind of served as a main hub where people would take what was called back then computer-based or CD training. So if you needed to take a training on negotiations or maybe communicating with your peers and colleagues or how to handle conflict, these were topics that could be pretty much tracked on a local computer. So, in other words, the software had to be installed on a computer. It's not like our software as a service systems that we use today, like Blackboard or Google Classroom, to name a few. But the modern LMS that we have begun to know today really started getting its, I would say, its birth or its rebirth, if you will, in the 1990s. That's when we started to see the advent of certain LMSs that included the ability to connect synchronously in the form of on-demand learning, such as webinars and things of that nature. And of course, in the 2010s, since that time, we've seen these LMSs continue to grow and really become powerful tools to enable distance learning. So, it's only been around for a couple of decades, but think of the LMS, and I'm going to tie the LMS back to chapter 1 of our textbook. In chapter 1, Clark and Mayer talked about e-learning and how to deploy e-learning and how e-learning could be a benefit to many different learners. Well, one of the ways that you can deploy e-learning is through the use of a learning management system. And that is why it's important for us to understand the concept of what is a learning management system, what's so important about it, not only from a teacher perspective, from an administrative perspective, but also from a student perspective. And it's important for us to really recognize that whenever you launch any kind of distance learning, one of the things that you're going to have to ask yourself from a design perspective, how am I going to deploy it? And an LMS is usually one of the ways that we're able to do so. So tying and linking this concept of an LMS back to chapter 1, again, when you think about the promise of e-learning, right? We know that e-learning is supposed to provide on-demand learning for students. They can take it anywhere, anytime. But when you start to look at some of the future trends that are being predicted for learning management systems, we're looking to include additional tools and resources such as augmented realities, M-learning, which some of you may know better as mobile learning, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, the inclusion of gamification, MOOCs, massive online open courses, which we'll talk about in later weeks as well, further automation, as well as looking at what I'm going to point you to here at the bottom of the screen, which is the NGDLs, the Next Generation Digital Learning Environments, which is expected to become the successor to learning management systems as we know them today. So the learning management system as a tool is not going away. The expectation here is that it will evolve and begin to include a variety of additional tools and resources and take a much more modular approach in the future. But until we get to that point, it's important for you to understand why the LMS is important. And again, it's important because we have to deploy training. And it's not just about getting the content out there. How do you track it? How do you assess that people are taking it, they're using the content? An LMS can help with all these things. But more importantly, for the student, it gives them that one-stop shop, the place where they know that if they needed to get content or materials, or I just need to know where to go and get my e-learning or my media or my video, whatever that item is they need for an activity, for a lesson, the LMS can serve as that central one-stop shop. So with that, that gives you the foundation of, or at least the primer of what you're going to be reading about in our 2 articles related to learning management systems this week. If you have any questions, email me. I will gladly jump in and talk to you more about it. With that, enjoy week number 3, folks, and we'll talk very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.